Welcome to Derisky Business, an economic security podcast from the Center for a New American Security in Washington, D.C. I'm your co-host, Emily Kilcrease.
And I'm the other co-host, Geoff Gertz. Today we're talking with Alan Estevez, Undersecretary of Commerce for Industry and Security, who leads the U.S. government's work on export controls, and he's been in the middle of debates on how the U.S. can use controls to protect U.S. leadership in critical technologies.
Prior to his service at Commerce, the Undersecretary was a high-level Defense Department official. In our conversation, he shared how this informs his work today on protecting the U.S. military's overmatch in key technologies. We talked about why technology is at the red-hot center of the strategic competition with China, why Russia is still able to access Western-made chips and technologies, and why all of our cars might be spying on us. Geoff, what surprised you about the discussion?
Alan covers a lot of ground, but I think one thing that really jumped out to me, he's got a great anecdote about how he's working with his state and treasury counterparts to call up the CEOs of top chip companies and try and convince them not to be selling to, let's say, problematic vendors in China that are sending chips onto Russia. So really great details from Alan on this point.
And he does all of this work with the budget equivalent to the cost of less than 2 fighter jets. Enjoy! Derisky Business is supported in part by Amazon and by general support to the CNAS Energy Economics and Security Program. So Alan, welcome to Derisky Business.
Great, thank you, Emily. Good to be here.
So Alan, this is a podcast about economic security, and we always start with a question for our guests about what is economic security? Everyone comes to that question a little bit differently. So as you think about your mission at BIS and what that phrase means to you, how do you think about economic security issues and the role that BIS plays in the U.S. economic security agenda?
So here's going to be a strange answer for you. I don't think a lot about economic security. I think a lot about national security. And I come at things from that perspective. How do we protect the nation? How do we prepare the nation? Now, if you look at commerce writ broadly, past my bureau, obviously commerce is engaged in economic security across a number of spectrums. So if you looked at it from that perspective, the way I like to phrase it is that we play offense and defense. I'm the defense. So I'm middle linebacker of commerce's economic national security venture, if you would take it as that. So my focus, again, national security, protect the nation, protect America's technology from being used against us by our adversaries. In fact, the way I look at it is, you think about my previous life at DoD, where I was engaged in providing the technologies and capabilities to ensure that we had what we always call technological overmatch. In other words, that U.S. forces are never put in a position where the enemy has better equipment than we do. We always assume we'll have better training. My goal now is to ensure that a potential adversary isn't using our stuff to get better equipment. Now, one little side note, I do have the Defense Production Act authorities inside Bureau of Industry and Security, which can also be used for economic security measures and ensuring industrial base capacity inside the United States. Now, commerce writ large, we do have a whole bunch of things that we do for economic security, including, mostly in the other bureaus, looking at things like supply chain assurance, promoting American businesses. You can go on and on. Commercial space capability there, and of course, everyone's favorite, chips, where we are rebuilding the United States' industrial capacity to make the highest end microelectronics.
And as I've heard you say in other contexts, your real job is Chief Technology Protection Officer for America. So very much a national security mission. So appreciate your thoughts on that. We've got a lot to dig into today, including some of the recent actions announced by the Commerce Department, by BIS, related to the IT supply chain. We'll talk about Russia and export controls, how that's going. And of course, we want to talk a bit about China tech competition and the role that export controls and BIS is playing in that. And then as former bureaucrats, we'll also get a little bit into the questions around bureaucratic capacity, what you need to do your mission. More, great, done. Happy to hear it. You stole our talking point.
Great. Well, let's dig in. I thought maybe we'd start with an issue in the news last week, which is the ban on Kaspersky products that BIS announced. So I think it's notable for a number of reasons. Maybe kind of most important to me, this is the first time that we've seen BIS issue a final rule under the ICTS executive order, which is a Trump-era executive order for protecting the nation's information and communication technology services supply chain. So I think this is an EO that gives kind of quite wide-ranging authorities to BIS, but really helpful to hear your thoughts on kind of, why was Kaspersky the first final action that we've seen here? Can you explain kind of in simple terms, why do we need to ban Kaspersky, and what was the process to get to this point?
Sure. First of all, banning Kaspersky is, to me, a no-brainer. If you think about what virus protection software does, just on the easiest level, it's inside your computer. It's controlling the operating system of your computer and digging around in there. And it has access to almost every facet of the data on your computer. If you look at a company that's, variety of way they're headquartered, but, essentially headquartered in Russia, UK, blah, 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 but, headquartered in Russia. And under the jurisdiction of Russia legal structure, should there be a Russian legal structure that one would consider valid, but certainly, at the behest of the Kremlin to do things for the Kremlin. That's risky to Americans. So if you have Kaspersky software on your computer, you're probably not listening to this podcast. But if you do have Kaspersky software on your computer, go find something else as soon as you can. So what we did is essentially ban the sale of Kaspersky. We're not coming after people who have it on their computer, but they won't be able to get updates, which will mean that their computers are no longer protected by antivirus software that's up to date. So that's essentially, Kaspersky was out there. I won't say it was an easy pick. It took a long time. We did all the due diligence you're supposed to do. We talked to the company. We looked at mitigation strategies. We did first an investigation. The company had response time. So all those bureaucratic processes, due process of law, were followed in this case. And, frankly, the capacity of this new organization that we stood up in BIS took a while to build that capacity in order to engage in this action. We are thrilled that this rollout went as smoothly as possible. There's lots of things that we were considering in there, including what could Kaspersky do in the process. So again, if you have it on your computer, get it out. But that's the process that we followed to bring about this action. And I think it's a great first action for the ICTS team.
Yeah, it's a good public service announcement. So get the Kaspersky antivirus software off, and if you've got a TikTok app on, please get rid of it. And then America's cell phones will be much more secure. One thing that was interesting about this series of announcements was it wasn't just the commerce action. There was also, there was the ICTS action. There was an entity list designation. There were sanctions on Kaspersky officials. It seems like this was a really coordinated approach, trying to look at this problem set and how we use a range of tools to get at that, which is kind of unusual for government actions to see it so well coordinated.
Oh, we try to do that all the time. It's actually true. We do try to coordinate our actions, and you see when we've been doing actions with regard to Russia, we tend to try to coordinate our actions with state and Treasury so that we're all in sync with each other, and that's what we did in this case. We put an entity list action on Kaspersky. It's not like Kaspersky's getting a whole bunch of exports, but we did want to put them out there as a actor of concern. Obviously, having Treasury, SDN, a couple of those things at the same time, all works in conjunction to protecting the American people.
Mm-hmm. So the Kaspersky example does seem like, as you said, a no-brainer, right? So get the Russian antivirus software off your computer. The other major action that we've seen recently related to the IT space is, of course, the connected vehicles action. So there's, the proposed rule of looking at connected vehicles. So really just, acknowledging the fact that our cars are basically a bunch of chips held together by steel at this point. And from a risk perspective, like, I get that, right? I've spent a lot of time in government too, looking at these sorts of risks, and you can see how it would be, what was the phrase that Secretary Raimondo used, a surveillance platform on wheels. Like, I understand that. But I think for a lot of folks, seeing that action, it felt like, why is that one of the first actions that we're seeing come out of the broader ICTS program? So what's your thinking of, why connected vehicles are so important to address from a risk perspective, and where do you see that process moving?
Yeah. First, let me just say, there's other things going on in the ICTS office. So
would you like to tell us what they are?
I wouldn't, but I will say, think of it as, you're seeing a duck cruising across the water. There's like a lot of paddling going on underneath that water. Whereas the iceberg, you're seeing the stuff that's on the tip. So why connected vehicles? Again, let me use the DoD thing. We used to talk about something like the F-35. It's no longer just a plane. It's a flying computer or a flying sensor suite. Your car is a flying sensor suite or a driving sensor suite cruising across the road. And that's not just, electric vehicles. That's any fairly new vehicle. I don't know about you, but my car gets a software update pretty regularly. My dashboard alerts me, hey, you need to get a software update. So, of course, I, download the software update. Things that make the vehicle run better or do things with the dash screen, et cetera, et cetera. That software update could also be a malicious software update if it was coming from an adversarial power. So let's say you were going to do something in the Pacific area one day. And the day before you started, the commencement of your operation, you said every car that gets a software update, when they push the button to start that car, nothing happens. Your car becomes a nice brick in your driveway or wherever it happened to have been when that occasion occurs. So that's just, easy stuff. Now, I bet your phone book's connected to your car. I bet you call people from your car. All that data is running for your car. Your car knows a lot about you. It knows who your contacts are. It knows who you like often amongst those contacts because you probably call them more often than others. Your car knows where you go all the time, assuming you're driving your car. Your car knows your route. Your car knows your regular habits, your daily routine, more or less, that you're in your vehicle. All that data is collected in your car. All that data can be, just like software update comes from somewhere, notice in, notice out. So all that data is available should there be a malicious code in there to say, send me that. Your car does tell you that, hey, it's time for your oil change, new modern connected vehicles, or your tires are low, blah, 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 blah. Your dealer's notifying you that it's time for there's software, there's data going back and forth between your car and someone else. So now, if that someone else is an adversarial power collecting a lot of data on Americans, we consider that a national security threat. Ergo, connected vehicles raised to the top of the level of why we're looking at connected vehicles and what to do about them.
I think I'm going to get into my car for the commute home and look at it entirely differently now and be a little bit afraid.
Look, side note, I was overseas talking to someone, a senior government official in another government, and I started talking about connected vehicles, and they said to me, well, I ride my bike to work, so I'm not so worried.
That's right. It's the green transition. We're all just going to get on the bike. It's fine. It's totally fine. Yeah. One more question on the connected vehicles. It kind of came out in the mix of, a whole bunch of policy concerns around, overcapacity of Chinese EVs. Like, there's a broader conversation around autos that's happening right now. So there is a critique that I've heard, which is that the connected vehicles could potentially be abused, like for protectionist reasons. What do you say to that critique?
Certainly, the levers of government can be abused, of course, for not the reasons that they're there. We made a concerted effort to show this as a national security concern, not as an economic protectionist concern. And the fact that, the administration came out with tariffs on Chinese vehicles, I mean, that's the route for economic concerns about overcapacity of Chinese vehicles subsidized for cheap. The reason we moved out right now on connected vehicles is, frankly, it's easier when there's not a lot of them on the road, right? It would be much harder to go into this if I looked outside here on Pennsylvania Avenue off 17th Street, where your studio is, and said, look at all those BYD cars out there, right? It's much easier when I'm looking at it, a bunch of Audis and BMWs and Fords and Chryslers and GMs.
Great. So we talked about Kaspersky. We talked about connected vehicles. You sort of hinted that there's a lot more going on kind of beneath the surface over at the ICTS office, sort of recognizing, obviously, not going into any details there. But I wonder at a general level, we have these two examples now. On the one hand, Kaspersky, a kind of targeted investigation of a single company, kind of banning them from the U.S. market. On the other hand, the connected vehicle, a sort of class-based rule trying to sort of set broader standards. I wonder sort of, generally, how do you think about balancing those two possible approaches? And kind of, do you see the office over the long term leaning more into one or the other?
I'm personally a fan of class-based rules, if you would. And not just in the ICTS space, in the export control space as well. And that's where, I drew my ideas on this. And the reason for that is this. You look at what we do with the entity list, look at what we do with Kaspersky, and there's a little bit of whack-a-mole around that. Kaspersky is a fairly big company, so it's, it's a big whack. But half the time I'm entity listing parties that can pop up with a new name in a new place, like, a drug dealer at a strip mall type thing. And, you have to do it. You have to go after bad actors when you see them in the world, and we have the authorities to do that. But it's much more effective to say, here's the rule set. Here's the parameters by which that rule set of concern within that rule set for us. If you are inside that threshold, in the ICTS world, it's a no sale in the United States, or it's a mitigating factor around that, depending on how what the issue is. And that could apply to a whole bunch of other things, including drones and things like that, we certainly could be looking at. And then, the export control space is the kind of strategic controls we put on in October 22 and October 23 on, here's the class of equipment that we shouldn't be selling to China at all.
And then maybe just one more kind of ICTS-related question. So, I think you said exactly right. Kaspersky is sort of a no-brainer case. And yeah, as you described it, there was sort of a very long due process. Very recommend any of our listeners to go look at the specific Kaspersky website that ICTS office set up that has kind of all kinds of background info on sort of the theory of the case and why this action is necessary. So, reading that in my mind, just a little curious, is some of that work kind of pre-buttal to a possible litigation case? How are you thinking about how this might be challenged? Again, going back to this sort of being the first time that this new authority has been used, do you kind of expect there to be litigation, and how prepared is your office for it?
I'd say we're prepared for litigation. Refrain from saying whether I expect it or not. That's up for Kaspersky to make a decision. I think we built a strong case on the rationale. I think we did our due diligence and took our time in doing that due diligence. So if they happen to bring a suit, I think we'll prevail.
So let's move on and talk about tech competition with China. Obviously, BIS and you personally have been so involved in innovating the use of export controls as part of how we manage the strategic competition with China. You referenced some of the export controls that we've seen roll out over the last 2 years. And, we've done quite a bit of work on this at CNAS, where there's really been this sea change in how we look at tech controls of, not really trying to think that we can distinguish between civilian and military end uses or end users in China, and instead just setting clear technical cut lines and saying, if it's more advanced than this, it just can't go to China. So walk us through a little bit about how this thinking has evolved since the start of the administration, kind of what's the strategic vision for how you want to use export controls to manage the tech competition with China, and what's your ultimate objective?
Sure. And let me get back to, I'm not trying to do this as a competition versus who's going to make better tech. It is a competition to who's going to have a stronger national security apparatus and deterrent effect. Our goal would be that President Xi would wake up every morning and say, this isn't the morning, because the deterrent effect would say I could lose in whatever military action they want to take. And recognize that all these things we're talking about, there's people out there said, microelectronics, semiconductors, the new oil. Semiconductors are pretty much a driver of any major weapon system today, as well as, of course, the daily life. So if you look at the way we've managed this, it's a small sliver, really, of semiconductors that we've put prohibition on. And it's really a small sliver of equipment that we've put restrictions on for China-wide, for PRC-wide. I mean, obviously we have different things going on with different bad entities. And the way I look at this is, again, going back to my DoD past. In the U.S., when I say I want to buy a new jet or build a new sensor suite, or a combination of the two, I can put out an RFP, and someone can respond to that RFP, whether it be one of the great primes, Lockheed or Raytheon, Northrop, or some of the newer companies like Palantir or Anduril, or companies that are diving into this space, or they can decide, I'm not interested in defense business for whatever reason, whether it's some reason that I won't go into, or it's too hard to do business with the DoD or the federal government writ large. I'd rather make high profit margins on sales over here and get a quicker return on my investment than this heavy dealing of bureaucracy that I have to deal with at DoD. Former number 2 acquisition official, I know with what I speak here. In China, you don't have that option, right? So that's, the basic of civil military fusion is like, hey, I need you to spend some time doing these things for me. So if we look at some of the things that they're doing are not economically sound, nonetheless, they're doing them, and they're doing them because it's going to enhance their military capacity. And it's, other influences, right? So that's great. I think, the president had an exchange with President Xi in the November summit, where essentially, the president told him, like, you're complaining about our export controls. You have the right as a sovereign nation to modernize your military. You just can't do it with our stuff. So when we stop the highest end semiconductor manufacturing equipment or those highest end chips, those are the things that could go into the highest end applications, including supercomputers, which are, used in foundational nuclear research. I'll leave it at that. And certainly the new boom of what everyone wants to talk about, and I'm sure we're going to talk about it next too, is artificial intelligence, right? Which, again, from a military perspective, we're just scratching the surface. Former chief logistician at DoD, AI, logistics, there's a dream come true. You got to get it trained right, but it's, and if you look at the vast distances of the Pacific, we can't afford to fight like we fought in World War II, even though, it's kind of the same battle space, right? It's got to be much faster because you're going to go at the speed of technology. So having tools that tell you, all right, I can't build these big bases and big supply depots like I had in Afghanistan because those are like missile shots, a day. So it's got to be more dynamic flow of sustainment support into the Pacific. That's just on the log side, which is the more benign side of military application. Start talking about command and control, start talking about targeting and those type of things. Artificial intelligence has all sorts of viable uses. And then just to close this part out, Frank Kendall, my former colleague, Pentagon, Secretary of the Air Force, went off flying a couple of weeks ago in an F-16. He sat in the pilot seat with an Air Force pilot behind him as the plane flew itself in a dogfight against a top Air Force test pilot to a draw. And yeah, that's a DARPA one-off, but that's the future of warfare. So why do I want the Chinese to have our capability and, NVIDIA chips, AMD chips, the best chips in the world for artificial intelligence? They'll have to figure it out on their own.
Yeah, I mean, that logic is I find it very persuasive, at least, right? When you're thinking about not even just today's military capabilities, but what the future of combat could look like. It seems clear that there could very well be a strong role for AI. So, I think the national security case is clear. There is, another perspective on this, though, which is that AI is also going to be really important for lots of functioning of the economy, for economic growth, for economic prosperity. And my sense has been that that's been a little bit of the pushback we've heard, at least internationally, from some other countries about, are we trying to contain China? Are we trying to keep China down? They don't seem fully persuaded that it's solely a national security case, or that the U.S. is really recognizing the economic implications that this could have for China if we're really saying you can't have these super advanced chips for the military purposes, but also all the other purposes, again, because we're not trying to make those distinctions between military and civilian anymore.
I mean, I hate to use this analogy, but in the 50s, nuclear power was like seen at that time, and it's probably seen again suddenly as a great advancement for mankind in certain sectors, right? And that sector did not include a piece of ordnance, right? So you control the piece of ordnance side, and you put protections around the beneficial use side.
So that's what we're trying to do with the chips.
That's what we're trying to do with chips.
Okay.
Well, maybe building on that then. So that's what we're trying to do. I guess the question is do you think it's working? And what's your sort of assessment of the effectiveness here? Maybe, particularly we've seen some public reporting of sort of Huawei and SMIC kind of building their own chips. And, there's always this question of have our controls inadvertently sort of sped up the indigenization process in China as they're building up their own advanced chip sector? Kind of how do you assess that question? What do you make of those critiques?
Yeah. So a couple of different facets of that. One on whether we're driving quicker indigenization. Frankly, our assessment is they were driving towards indigenization regardless of what we do. Right? They want to be self-sufficient. We may be giving them greater rationale in that space right now, but they were marching down this path anyway. At best, whenever, name its time, COCOM, whatever, export controls are not, we like to think of, they're not the dam, the water stops and nothing leaks out of the dam, right? Tech changes, time changes. So the best thing I'm going to do with regard to China and chips and military capacity and capability is slow them down and cost them more. Right? So I'm imposing cost and I'm buying time, right? Which means we need to be taking that time gap that we're opening up here and building capacity and capability here. So it's, gets to that offense defense thing. I'm going to hold the wall for a little while here. My buddies over at the Pentagon need to spend some time, and then, frankly, American innovation needs to be driving.
And the chips office.
Yeah, for sure. And $50 billion, $39 billion is a drop in the bucket for the fab capability. But it's like a 10-to-1 ratio of private money going in to build that capacity. So for every dollar we're given, private sector is putting in 10. I think we're doing a great job there. But so we're going to slow them down, but we're never going to stop them. They're going to develop artificial intelligence capacity and capability. They have very smart engineers. Many of them went to the same university as our smart engineers in this space. And they have a lot of money, and they're going to spend that money. The fact that they can make a 7-nanometer chip for a phone or a 7-nanometer-ish chip for a phone, it's a phone. The fact that they can make an Ascend 910B GPU, that's not quite an NVIDIA A100, which of course is a couple of generations off from NVIDIA today. But yeah, that's troublesome, right? So, but I've already have a gap, and their capacity to do that means they're going to spend a lot of money, to fab those chips, and then the data centers they build with those chips will not be as efficient and effective, and certainly energy efficient, as a chip built with a A800 or a Blackwell or the next gen NVIDIA chip. This isn't a pitch for NVIDIA, but it certainly does not need my...
they seem to be doing fine. I wanted to follow up on that, just about this question of keeping pace with the fast evolving technology, right? We're all fascinated by these large language models in the AI space. Although honestly, they're still really weird, right? They're still telling you to eat rocks and put glue on your pizza. So there's some stuff that isn't going right. But obviously the speed of change is pretty impressive, right? How do you in BIS stay on top of that? And not just in AI, you're talking about all of the sectors that have strategic importance. You're talking about chips, you're talking about quantum, which we haven't even gotten into yet, even traditional technologies like aerospace or maritime, right? That's a huge problem set. So what does BIS do to make sure that you're, keeping pace as much as you can with just understanding what's happening in industry and then updating controls to reflect that, and then add an additional layer of complication, trying to work through the multilateral process, which may or may not be working right now, given some complications with Wassenaar that we can get into. But how do you handle that whole soup to nuts problem set?
Yeah, and it is a huge problem set, frankly. This is a podcast probably going to Washington people who live in the bubble that you and I all live in here. But I just want to make a point that federal government salaries probably don't equal what the salary of OpenAI for a top engineer might be. And I have no idea what Sam's paying people, but it's probably more than my GS14. But with that said, I have some pretty good people who want to serve in government who have come and done or are doing their time. Some of them are bright young people who want to come work in BIS and learn the ropes and give back to their country. So there's that. A quick story of that. I did something at the Air Force Academy. It was a China-related thing. They had kids from around the country. It wasn't just Air Force cadets there. And this kid came up to me at the after reception, and he said to me, he asked me some questions on CHIPS office type stuff. And I said to him, "Hey, you're pretty smart. That's, what do you want to do when you graduate?" And he said, "I want to go work for this Bureau of Industry and Security."
Did you just die with excitement at that point? Yes, my mission is achieved.
I know someone who works there.
I got a guy for you.
So go finding people like that, going to the think tanks around town who have good knowledge in this space. I've hired a couple of people from a different think tank than this one who wanted to come work for us, younger staff, who are doing great at BIS and are key players. Then there's go out and talk to industry. So, when we did our complex rules certainly when we did the rule last year, I personally spent time along with some of my senior team and some of my tech people that I brought in to do this kind of stuff, talking to NVIDIA and AMD and Intel and OpenAI and Anthropic and what makes a good GPU for AI. What about if I did this to the parameter, how would it work? Should I be thinking of split chips? All those type of things. So it's industry works with us for a number of reasons. One, at the end of the day, and I'll quote Secretary Raimondo, "Democracy is good for business." And number two, they'd rather have me regulate smartly rather than regulate dumbly. So, there's certainly good input and good dialogue going on with industry on this. Now, for the longer term, I truly believe I need DARPA-like authorities for hiring at BIS. And the way DARPA operates is, DARPA says, "Hey, I have this real hard problem." They go find someone in academia or business and say, "Hey, you want to come work on the hardest of the hard problems that you've been spending your career doing research on?" and come do this for 3 years in government, and go back to your university or to your business. And lots of people want to do that and come do that. I need those type of flexible hiring authorities.
All right, is Congress listening to this? Because it sounds like that's a congressional authority that you need on the BIS, right?
Absolutely.
So, okay.
All right, we're keeping a list of the bureaucratic capacity points that we need to push to the hill, so
That's right.
This is helpful. So maybe one more question on this. So, I think we've focused a fair bit on kind of controlling the chips and related equipment going to China. But there's also kind of other ways that we're thinking about how China gets access to some of these, authorities and kind of control here. So obviously, in the update last year, we saw there was the extension of some licensing restrictions to the Middle East, at least sort of largely as I understand it, dealing with the threat of kind of China accessing sort of cloud centers built in the Middle East. There's also sort of related work around sort of know your customer on some of the infrastructure as a service rule. There's sort of been some open debate about should we have export controls on the AI models themselves. So kind of a bit curious how you're thinking on sort of, where's this going next as we sort of are looking beyond the kind of hardware and sort of the equipment itself to a bit more the sort of amorphous kind of controlling the AI, as it were.
Yeah. So, and again, it still is all kind of how do we control AI? And there's lots of different facets of that. Export controls is a piece of that. There's what's the security standards and safety standards and things that NIST is doing. A lot of it, Commerce has ended up in the middle of, not necessarily BIS, though I certainly find myself learning more about AI than I ever expected when I took this job 3 years ago. So the other thing is, of course, export controls, go back to my dam analogy, which just really came from Eric Horshorn. So I'll give Eric, in a different context, but I'll give him credit for that, one of my predecessors. I'm going to do this. People are going to figure out how to work around what I'm going to do. I'm talking about that in the Russia context, for sure. We tried to, last October, close a whole bunch of loopholes. We stopped sales for not just China in China, but Chinese companies operating outside of China. So if you can't get a chip over X parameter, I'm trying not to use the brand names anymore, into China, why would I sell it to Alibaba or ByteDance or whoever working in Malaysia, let's say. We also, from the Russia context, have seen, lots of diversion routes, and we looked at places where those diversion routes occur, even though, just let's be clear, and I'm going to break my own rule that I said 2 seconds ago. NVIDIA chip is not something, an H or an A100 or an A800 is not something you put in your pocket. Right? It's something you can sit and eat lunch on. Right? So, diversion is not as easy as you may think, but it's still out there. And then 3, to your point on, data centers, and we wanted to get some sense of control. And so, we're still working through the process around that. So that's kind of why we did that expansion. And then, of course, there is a discussion of should we control model weights? Is it too soon to control model weights? So I want to put a soft control out now that I could tighten later on. So that debate's ongoing, and it's a good debate. I have 2 thoughts in there. One, I'm always concerned about getting controls before it's time, because once I have a control, people in this town expect me to use them, even if it's not the appropriate time to use them. Right? So you do want to temper how you exercise the authorities so that you are targeted as we're trying to be. So that's kind of the picture there.
So let's talk about Russia a bit, although this conversation will quickly take us back to China. But just to focus, but let's focus on the Russia export controls. I mean, as you well know, post invasion of Ukraine, there was this massive wave of sanctions and export controls used as a sanctioning instrument. The broad coalition of countries joining in that, just really dropping the hammer down across the commerce control list for a wide range of technologies. And, the kind of pithy comment of, you can't even send a toothbrush or a pencil to a Russian military end user at this point, right? So really stringent controls. And, at the time, and I was guilty of this too, it was these are crushing export controls. We're going to kill the Russian war machine. And that didn't quite happen, right? So like what we've seen is this, and maybe it shouldn't have surprised anyone, Russia has very robust diversion supply chains. They've got a track record of being able to divert and get around controls and sanctions, and we're kind of seeing that adaptation, and we're adapting in response. But I'm just, kind of curious your thoughts on where we go from here. It's not like the US and the sanctioning coalition has eased up, right? Like we continue to see entity list designations come out. We continue to see a ratcheting of the economic statecraft tools to try to get at these widespread diversion networks. But it still seems like there's a decent amount of the critical goods and microelectronics that are going to Russia. Maybe it's harder for them to get it. Maybe it's more costly, right? So there might be a cost imposition strategy. But what else can the U.S. and partners do at this point to try to really ratchet down on that? Both, thinking about how China plays into this, but also like independently outside of China, how do we get at this problem set?
And it is a hard problem set. And it's not for lack of trying. And it's, of course, I have an enforcement arm. And this is, what Matt Axelrod wakes up thinking about every day, even more than the PRC problem, because this is truly an enforcement issue at this point. And you can't get at some of the bad actors in this space. So when you look at the numbers, and like you, I thought it would be more effective sooner. One, the Russian industrial base, to your point, Russia's been doing this since the 50s, probably since before that, but since the 50s for sure, building diversion routes and diversion capabilities and diversion techniques. Happen to be reading J. Edgar Hoover's biography, so the 50s stuff is on my mind. So they have long history and practice of this. One. Two, while we have 39 nations working with us on this, mostly the top industrial nations in the globe, there are a number of outliers there that provide easy access and routes. Turkey, India, the Stans, I've met with people from all these countries, in the case of like the Stans, I said to the minister from Kazakhstan, I recognize you live in a tough neighborhood, and I recognize, that your economy and Russia's are intertwined, and I recognize that your neighbor doesn't believe in international borders, and that probably all those things
makes one a little nervous.
Makes one a little nervous. Right? But that's not where the problems are. All those countries that I just mentioned are not where the problems are. When, especially in the space of microelectronics and the microelectronics flow to Russia, it's all about China. And then there's other capabilities that are, either made in China that are going, which is harder for us to control. But microelectronics, I'd say 90% of the flow of U.S. brand microelectronics flows through China to Russia. So how do you get after that? Jose Fernandez at State, Brian Nelson and Treasury, and I have jointly called the 5 top companies whose microelectronics were showing up in Russia at the CEO level. So we got the CEOs on the line, told them, this is not a call about compliance or you're doing something wrong, but here's data that we saw. Here's the last touch in China that we're aware of. So who the exporter was from China, or we gave them other places in the world too, but it's China. And would you, is that one of your distribution network members? If so, stop using them. If not, try to figure out how they got your part. One, do some extra screening on certain key components. Again, these are all legacy chips, right? So they're not chips that we were just talking about that are banned in PRC, but there are things like analog device controllers and like that. Unfortunately, if you open up a Shahad drone, the first thing you see, and it's not good for them either. Companies do not want their stuff ending up in apartment buildings and hospitals and town squares in Kyiv or Kharkiv or Odessa or wherever in Ukraine. So obviously we got very good response from those companies. We gave them the data that we had. They are going through that data. If they find a direct hit, they've dropped those companies from their list of approved resellers. If not, they're trying to track how it ended up going from here to there. And some of this has been awash in the system for years, so it makes it even harder. It's not like it's all new production, but there is some new production that we're seeing there too. So we gave them all the data, and we're working with those companies to help them try to choke it off on their side of the equation.
Yeah, that's really helpful and interesting. So I think this idea that the companies are being sort of engaging in this helpfully makes sense and sort of tracks to me that, again, sort of, they don't want their chips ending up in these missiles sort of any more than anyone else does. But, the other thing companies often want is sort of real black and white clarity on what is legal and what is not. And it seems a lot of this work is sort of moving into a bit of a more sort of gray space of sort of nudging, looking for sort of voluntary compliance measures where we're not just coming out and sort of, putting this Chinese supplier on an entity list or something like that. So you could talk a little bit about sort of, how are you thinking about these more voluntary sort of nudge tools rather than, let's just put all these suppliers on the entity list and be done with it?
Yeah. The problem with doing that is it's like just so many, and then they'll just change the name anyway. So if I see a really bad actor, obviously we'll do that. But this is, and I raised this with my counterpart at MOFCON, by the way. And asked him, these are goods going to Russia. You say you want the Ukraine war to end, but you're building up the capacity there. And his response was, these are things for Game Boys and washing machines. And I said, for missiles and drones.
They always give a very carefully worded response on this, which is, we maintain a strict export control regime for dual-use goods. And it's like, that's not the same thing as saying that you're not sending them to Russia.
Well, in fact, I made a sort of glib comment in that meeting when I had this discussion with him, where he said, how would you want me to stop this? And I said, I can teach you.
Yeah. Send a bunch of enforcement agents over. We got a plan for this. Yeah, look, if they wanted to stop it, I'm sure they could do more than they are currently.
They could.
Yeah.
So some of this is, it's not even nudge, right? These companies want to work with us on this type of stuff. It's when you get like the third-party companies, then it becomes harder, and sometimes you have to make an example. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I was going to say put a head on a pike, but
that's an example.
Yeah, I didn't realize BIS had that authority.
The medieval version.
Dream big, Alan. One thing that we've been thinking about, on exactly that point, right? Like, how do you get at this, illicit ecosystem within China, which, again, hard problem set, right? And, at some point, do we need to start using, bigger sticks, right? Do we think about financial sanctions? Obviously, there's been a bit of bubbling conversation around, do we need to start hitting Chinese banks with financial sanctions, et cetera? What do you think about kind of that mix of tools? Do we need to escalate our enforcement to really make China take this seriously?
Well, first of all, the secondary sanction rule that Treasury put out, I think it was in December, actually has had a chilling effect on a lot of the movement we saw, which is goodness. Now, look, I can't speak for Secretary Yellen or Adiyama or Brian, but I think they're doing a great job. And Brian and I talk every 2 weeks to make sure we're in sync on stuff. So this is an ongoing dialogue. And then, so there's always, if we do this, what happens here and what are the other connotations? We're always looking at when to ratchet.
So switching gears a bit, there's been discussion that I know you've been a part of about how we think about the international cooperation on tech controls broadly. A lot of conversation around the Wassenaar arrangement, which is the kind of the international coordinating body to voluntarily set controls. It's country agnostic. It's not designed to specifically target China. Russia's a member, which seems problematic these days, right? So it does seem like there's a need to do something perhaps additional to Wassenaar. So how are those conversations going with international partners these days?
Yeah, so different facets. Obviously, in the high-end microelectronics sector, we did something a little more ad hoc.
Yep.
And same thing in the Russia context. In fact, that you could say that's ad hoc too. And great kudos to Matt Borman for working that leading up to the Russian invasion before there was really PAS leadership in place. The Senate confirmed for people who don't know that on this, listen to this podcast, which is probably about no one.
No one that listened to the podcast, or no one that knew that?
No one that didn't know that.
It's early days. Who knows?
Yeah. So look, Wassenaar, Australia, all those things serve a great purpose. Obviously, Wassenaar is not working at 100% right now. A number of countries are passing Wassenaar rules in what we call consensus -1. Japan, Canada, UK, France, I think Sweden or Norway. Can't remember exactly which. Have already done. We have one in the tube that's that. So we need to work through those processes. To me, though, the issue that really I want to get after is even Wassenaar, when it's working at 100%, is not something that keeps the pace of the speed of technology. So as I keep saying, if I want to stop quantum, shouldn't I operate at the speed of quantum, not at the speed of a snail?
Yeah, seems right.
Right, which might mean a different format where here's the rule set. The countries that have the tech that's of concern, kind of the ad hoc way we did that, but under an umbrella, under some kind of rule set that we wouldn't have to make up when we go along.
Great. So, we also want to get into a bit of a nerdy topic here, but one that dear to our hearts, thinking about kind of bureaucratic capacity for economic security. So, obviously, as we've talked a lot about already today, we've seen BIS's mission and authority expand significantly in recent years without necessarily a similar increase in the resources and staffing that you have under your authority. So kind of curious your thoughts of, how is your agency kind of keeping up with all these changes? And maybe just to kind of put the question directly to you, if you could double your budget tomorrow, where would you put those resources into?
Good question. So let me just, the story I tell people on this is before the Reagan Forum last fall in Simi Valley. I had been out there before because I was doing something about Hoover, and then I was visiting my field office, my enforcement guys in LA. So I'm already in California, and my phone rings at 7 a.m, California time. And I look down, secretary, and I pick it up. The question that came to me without good morning, Alan, was, how much does a fighter jet cost?
I know where this is going.
And I said, which one? As any good former acquisition official at the DoD would say. And I said, round it up to about $100 million with some bells and whistles on it per copy. And she said, good, great. Next day at Reagan, she said something to the effect of, he's funded at the cost of 2 fighter jets. He needs another 1 or 2 jets in order to do his job. And I 100% agree with that. If you look at some data, licenses, my budget's been flat since 2010, aside from a bump up from ICTS. So there's money that came in for that program. Licenses, 20,000 in 2012, 40,000 today. Average rule today, I don't know, but there's a lot of lawyers making a lot of good money in town.
That's economic security.
Yeah, based on the 375-page, 400-page, 500-page semiconductor rules that we're putting out these days. My foundational computer system that I have, 90s technologies fielded in 2006. If I say, give me the data on how many licenses went to name an entity, well, we have to do a manual search of that because there's lots of ways that SMIC can come across it. Is it semiconductor manufacturing or is it Shanghai or seriously. So, and if I say how many licenses to an entity listed party, again, manual search through BIS data. That is not the way to be doing business. There's no Google for me inside that's for my questions, much less for the oversight committees that would like that kind of information too.
There you go. So it's in Congress's interest to appropriate more money for BIS.
It is in Congress's interest to appropriate more money for BIS. So, we think our assessment, frankly, is I need about foundational $75 million a year more outside of IT, and then I need probably another $100 million over a 4 or 5 year period to rebuild my IT foundation. I need, and some of this I'm already bringing in. I need tools like Palantir. I need supply chain elimination tools, so that our licensing officers and our enforcement officers have the data they need to build cases and to do it. I need case management tools. There's so much that is just we need there. And where would that money go? It's a little bit of a mix of both shoe leather and capability, like those kind of applications for enforcement. It's some of those things, more licensing officers and capability for those licensing officers. It's more international affairs type people. So I can do the things that we were just talking about on how to make the multilateral capability work. It can't be just me and Borman or Kendler out on the road all the time. Right? You need that foundational stuff. So we would like some enhancements, and frankly, we're talking to the Hill. Now, they're obviously operating under the budget, whatever the version of Budget Control Act is right now, the deal that the president got with McCarthy Johnson.
All right, so it sounds like you've got a plan for more money. You just need the more money. We're going to do 2 last quick questions just to round out what has been a really fantastic conversation. So we'd like to try to get out of our DC bubble a little bit, or out of the Brussels bubble, or out of the Tokyo bubble, right? Most Americans probably, out of that bubble too. I'm going to put you in the middle of a cornfield, and you meet a farmer, and why does this person care about economic security, right? Why should most Americans care about these issues, right? Why should their tax dollars go to BIS, right? I think it can be sometimes hard to connect the dots and make this feel tangible for people that don't think about this stuff on a day-to-day basis. So what's your case?
Yeah. Well, and I'm going to make it more complicated than the cornfield thing, because again, if you ask the economic security question, what most people out in the cornfield want is food on the table, low inflation, supply chains that work. The world isn't built that way, unfortunately, and COVID woke up people to supply chains that I happened to be out in the private sector at the time talking about issues around supply chains again because of my background, and it's wow, this stuff is now on the front pages of the Journal and the Post every day. Usually when I talked about supply chains in the Pentagon, people went X's for eyes and yawned a little bit. Unless you were in combat, then you really care.
Right. It matters.
You really care. Right. So from an economic security point, that we need to be able to provide people the tools and the infrastructure and the jobs that make their lives better. From my little foxhole in BIS, and I didn't mean to use a DoD analogy there, again, it's in the national security sphere, and it's more esoteric for them, but I am protecting them, protecting their democracy, and protecting our way of life by having the capability of the United States to deter its adversaries.
Great. And then, the last question I like to ask all our guests is any recommendation you might have of interesting books or podcasts or articles that you've read or listened to recently. Sort of what should our Derisky Business listeners be paying attention to?
So the easy answer on that for me is Chip Wars, which is kind of like the Bible of, and it's an easy read and a fascinating read for those of you who haven't.
Happy to give a plug for Chris Miller. Yeah.
But you know what I'm reading right now? No Winners in the Game.
Oh, that's cheating. But good, if you're actually reading that, I'm very pleased. For our listeners, that was our big report that came out on the U.S. playbook for sanctioning China in the event of a contingency. So I hope you are actually reading that. But if not, great. Brownie points either way. Excellent. Well, couldn't pick a better way to close out the episode.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you very much for joining us. It's been a great discussion. Really enjoyed it.
Great. Really enjoyed it on my side, too. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Derisky Business, an economic security podcast from the Energy, Economics, and Security program at the Center for a New American Security. Have any questions or comments? Get in touch at deriskybusiness@cnas.org. The nerdier, the better. And find us wherever you get your podcasts every other Thursday.